someone near the back of the room close the doors into the common? That would be helpful. Thank you.
It's okay, I can get by.
Good morning, everyone. So this morning we prayed in our prayers of the people for all of us who are on a pilgrimage of grace. And I just want you to look at the front of your handout before we start. The Gospels are structured in such a way that at about the midpoint in each of the Gospels, Jesus turns towards Jerusalem. Whether he knew or not when he turns towards Jerusalem that eventually he was going to ride on a donkey into town at the beginning of the last week of his life is not clear. But one way to see this image of Jesus is to remember that he's been on a pilgrimage since the day of his birth, but certainly in the year or years, we're not clear whether it was 1 year or 3, since the Gospels narrate it differently, the 1 or 3 years of his ministry. He was clearly on a pilgrimage. What's clear also is that we are. Whether we're flying to Jerusalem tonight or not, we are on a pilgrimage. Either from the moment of your baptism or from the moment you decided that you wanted simply to explore faith, you've been on a pilgrimage. And you are following someone who's been in front of you. We call him Jesus. He's called Son of David in this morning's Gospel. He's called lots of things. But your way is set out before you, and someone has preceded you and also goes with you. So whatever your trepidations or joys may be on the road that you're traveling right now, you have a companion who's been traveling the way with you from before you were born. So let's begin with the prayer that's on the back of your sheet. It's from one of the Palm Sunday hymns. We're not going to sing it, but I'd like us to pray it. I'd like you to listen as you pray the words to the emphasis on lowliness. It's easy to lose track in the sort of triumphal nature of Palm Sunday that Jesus' procession was a lowly one. I'm going to have a lot to say about that in a minute or two. But just notice the lowliness that's emphasized in this prayer. So let's pray together. Ride on in majesty, in lowly pomp, ride on to die. O Christ, thy triumphs now begin, o'er captive death and conquered sin. Ride on in majesty, hark all the tribes Hosanna cry. Thy humble beast pursues his road, with palms and scattered garments strode. 3 times in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus predicts his own death. The Christian tradition has named this his passion predictions. I want to say a word about the word passion. You may have read the blog that I wrote this week, so this will be old news to you, but if you didn't, here it is. Passion means 2 very different things, though they are related. On the one hand, passion in the tradition that we are part of means suffering. But a more everyday meaning of the word passion is love. That kind of love that stirs you up and takes you in a direction that either you had planned or maybe you hadn't, but it took hold of you. The 2 come together in Jesus. Jesus has been taken hold of by a love that is hard for us to understand and impossible fully to comprehend. And it is that love that allows him to go this road that he knows is going to take him to his death. When he predicts his passion, every single time he predicts it, the 3 times in the Gospel of Mark, the disciples don't get it. They don't understand. They have varying reactions from Peter's taking Jesus to task and saying, "Lord, this must never happen to you," and Jesus rounding on him and calling him Satan. I'll say a bit about that in a moment. To the other 2 times, when once he predicts his passion in those 2 times, the disciples fall to arguing about who's going to be the greatest. If you don't think that human beings do this, you haven't been at as many bedsides of dying people as I have. People begin debating about what's going to happen with the legacy of those who are about to die. They don't get it. They don't get this road that he's on. They don't understand it. And one of the reasons that the thing that's called in scholarship the messianic secret, meaning Jesus tells them that the Son of Man, the Messiah, has to suffer and die, and then he says, now don't tell anybody. One of the reasons he says don't tell anybody is that the predictions of what Messiah was to be had gone in a very particular direction for most of Israel's history. And you can hear it this morning in blind Bartimaeus calling out. They expected the Messiah to be the son of David. Now that is a very particular picture. It means a warrior king who's going to be powerful and make Israel powerful. Jesus will have nothing of that kind of messiahship. Which is why he doesn't want the disciples to tell other people about it, because they'll simply misunderstand. They'll think that he's come for one reason, when in fact he's come for another reason. I'm going to tell you in a bit about the other reason. Why does Jesus round so harshly on Peter when Peter says, this must never happen to you? Well, if any of you have had to take a road that is different from the road either your parents or your society or your friends wanted you to take, and you took a different road, you know that one of the great traps is being tempted by people to go the easier road. I know some of you know about this. Any person in a 12-step program in this room knows about this. Anybody who has turned away from an addiction to a different way knows that one of the great traps is you have to leave certain friends behind, or they will pull you back into that other way. Peter wants to pull Jesus into this more triumphant Messiah way. And so he has to say to Peter, no way, Jose, Satan, tempter, I'm not going that way. It is hard to choose the road that Jesus is choosing. If you think he's waltzed down this road, you're not paying attention, friends. This is a hard choice for him. No one wants to die the way that Jesus has to die. But he believes it's what his destiny is. And he believes that somehow he is the one that God has chosen to reinterpret messiahship. So what is this new vision of messiahship? Well, in a word, it is servanthood. If you type servanthood in a word processor, you'll find that it's not a word. That's not by chance. It's not a word because our culture doesn't like it. Our culture doesn't like servanthood, and so it doesn't exist as a word in English. every time I typed servanthood in the blog for this week and on this handout, it had the red underline that says this isn't a word. But it is a word, and it is a way of living that Jesus chooses. And it is the way that he offers to his disciples and anyone who wants to follow him on the road. It's the way he offers to us. Now, it has a nice ring to it. Oh, I want to be your servant. I want to be helpful. I want to do the right thing. Nice idea. But when push comes to shove, it's hard to do. I'm not talking just about you. I'm talking about me. To be the servant of others is hard. In a part of the gospel we won't talk about today, you'll get to hear about it next week while those of us on pilgrimage in the Holy Land are there. Jesus is going to serve people a meal for his last meal on earth. We call it the Last Supper. We also call it Holy Communion, Eucharist, Mass, the Holy Mysteries. It's called lots of things. I don't know whether you ever paid attention or not, but Jesus feeds Judas. And he also feeds Peter. Judas, who's going to betray him to death, and Peter, who's going to deny that he ever even knew Jesus. Now, if you knew that two of your friends at your dinner table were going to betray you to death and deny they even knew you, would your first thought be to go ahead with the dinner party? Servanthood is not easy, because the road that Jesus chooses is servanthood, whether it's pleasant, whether it feels good, whether he gets something back from it or not. And he asks us, as he does in this morning's gospel, what do you want me to do for you? What kind of road do you want to go on? I dare say, I who have years of wonderful education and years of serving in a wonderful parish like this, who looks forward to retirement with a pension, I dare say that I don't really want to walk a road that's going to take me into a place I don't want to go. I don't know about you, but that's not my first thought about what I want to do with my life. But here we are, aren't we? We came here from whatever it is that we do day in and day out, because there's something also about this call to servanthood that is attractive, that does stir us up, that builds a passionate fire in us. Or I assume you wouldn't be here. You'd be worshiping at St. Mattress in All Springs. So something has stirred you up. I believe that it's the same thing that stirred Jesus up, God's Spirit. It has set some kind of a fire in you, however strong or weak the fire may be from moment to moment. And I think for most of us it varies. And he asks us, are we going to follow him on this road or not? Now let me be clear about something. The road of servanthood for most of us does not lead to a horrible death. Jesus is, as the reading from Hebrews that you may or may not have liked this morning, Jesus is the one who gives his life on our behalf, and we are not asked to lead ourselves down a road to a horrible death as if somehow that would save the world, because that's already happened. What he does ask us to do is to discover what kind of fire will spring up in us if we try out the road of servanthood. And what will get burned away, and what new things will come. It's a step-by-step, inch-by-inch kind of journey. If you feel despairing about how far you have come on the road, or how interested you are in this road, or how strong or weak the fire is in you, take heart. The disciples are complete dunderheads. They don't get it. They debated about who was going to be the greatest right after he tells them he's going to die. You don't have it that bad, most of the time. And I don't have it that bad most of the time. We're a little further along the road. But there are these moments of encounter with Jesus that get reflected in the Gospel of Mark that, if you don't over-historicize them, become stories about our encounters with Jesus, with this one in whom the Spirit of God burns as a passionate fire. And the first one for today is one you heard in church 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's the story of the rich man. If you have your Bible with you, it's in chapter 10, verse 17, that it begins. I want you to hear the first words. As Jesus was setting out on a journey. Now, Mark doesn't say it's to Jerusalem and death, because Jesus has already told you that. But that's where the journey's going. So, in Jesus' own mind, he knows that he's headed this road. And then this rich man runs up and kneels in front of him. I'm not going to read you the story. I'm going to tell you the story instead. He says, "You're a good teacher. Tell me what I have to do to inherit eternal life." And Jesus says, "Well, why do you call me good? Only God's good. Don't flatter me." And he says, "Well, you know what the commandments are." This is typical rabbinic dialogue, by the way, if you know Judaism. He's engaging the man to think. He's not just telling him the truth. He says, "You know the commandments." And he names some of them. By the way, adding one in that's not among the commandments. You shall not defraud. And the man says, "Teacher, I've kept these since I was a young person." One of the great lines of the gospel follows. Jesus looked at him and loved him. If you harbor anything in your heart that says Jews are not saved, take this to heart. Jesus loved this man who kept the commandments. But Jesus knows the road that Jesus himself is headed on, and he knows what needs to get stirred up in every single one of us, and in this man in particular, something needs to be stirred up. By the way, in all of us, something particular needs stirring. Our particular barrier to following Jesus on the road, or our barriers. And Jesus says, "Well, you know what? I love you. You've kept the commandments. You're on the right road, but there's one more thing. If you really want," I'm interpolating, this is good Jewish midrash. If you really, really want to be on the right road, there's only one more thing to do. Sell what you have, give it to the poor, come follow me. Notice the whole thing. Those of us who are pretty well off tend to get stuck on the first two. Sell what you have, give it to the poor. And we forget that he says, "Come follow me." The rest of the story is that the man goes away, it says, sorrowful, grieving, sad, because he has many possessions. He can't, to use Rainey's image from this morning's sermon, he can't throw off his cloak. He's not ready to go on the road yet. Yet. We don't know what happened to this man, by the way, later. By the way, he says also, Jesus does to him, you're going to have treasure in heaven. Because of a long history of Christian interpretation, many of us, when we hear that, think life after death. And I don't want to take that away from you. But heaven isn't just there then. Jesus has been talking about this kingdom that he's wanting us to be part of, this road of servanthood to the kingdom. And I think he's saying, you can have heaven right now if you do this. Now, you heard a really good sermon from Rainey about Bartimaeus, or you're going to if you haven't been to church yet. We go from the rich man's story very shortly thereafter to the Bartimaeus story. There's some verses in between. But the man who can't throw something off is at the center of one story. And then we get a story about someone who can throw things off. Lest you think this is completely impossible. By the way, there is dialogue after the story about with the rich man where the disciples say, wait a minute, you just said it's hard to enter the kingdom if you're rich? Then how can anybody enter the kingdom? If you've wondered what that's about, the Jewish mindset was, it is the wealthy who can keep the commandments more easily. And you can think why that would be the case. They can make the appointed sacrifices, they can do the right thing, because they're not scrapping for everyday living. They can take time to pray. They're not working 12, 15 hours a day, like many people still do. And Jesus says, well, you're right, it's pretty close to impossible, but with God, anything's possible. And as if to illustrate it, Mark puts this story in. Bartimaeus. And you've already heard it if you've been to church or you're about to hear it. It's in chapter 10, verse 46 and following. So I just want to be clear. Jesus has offered the rich man the road to servanthood. And the rich man has said, no thanks. At least the kind of servanthood Jesus had in mind. Remember, lest you start dumping on the rich man and feeling good about yourself, the rich man keeps all these commandments and Jesus loves him. It's just he can't take this next step yet. So then we get the story about Bartimaeus. And I am going to read this one aloud to you because for me this is the center of what I want to talk about today. They came to Jericho. So if you know your geography, Jesus is coming south and getting closer to Jerusalem. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. Hope you get the picture. Big crowd in the middle of the road, Bartimaeus off on the side. In a detail that we're going to hear and you've heard about if you heard Randy's sermon, the man is probably shrouded in a cloak. If you don't think that still happens, you're not looking at homeless people around us. There's a man every day that I take the train in from Attleboro that I pass on Clarendon Street, who has a sign that says, I'm homeless, I'm trying to support 3 children. And there's a cup in front of him. I don't know what your picture is of him. He's not all that old, and he's not completely disheveled, but he never looks up. He looks down at the ground. He might as well have a shroud over him. There is something going on in him You name it the way you want to name it. Shame, sadness, fear. He's carrying a lot. Carrying a lot. The rest of the sign says, anything helps, even pennies. God bless you. So Bartimaeus is beside the road. It says, when Bartimaeus heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Many sternly ordered him to be quiet. Probably part of the crowd, probably the disciples themselves. We already know that they don't quite get it. But he cried out even more loudly, Son of David, have mercy on me. What would you do? I assume people cry out after you on the streets, asking you for money. What do you do? The first thing it says is that Jesus stood still. It doesn't tell us what Jesus did while he was standing still. Wonderful time for you to do your own midrash. What do you think's going on in Jesus? Details matter in the gospel. Jesus is going to be stripped of his cloak before he's crucified. There's a kind of foreshadowing of that here. Was Jesus praying about the beggar, about himself? Was he just looking at him? Really, Rainey says this beautifully in her sermon, was he really seeing him? Seeing him as a fellow human being. Because Jesus doesn't call himself Son of David, he calls himself Son of Man. It's capitalized in English. There are no capital letters in Greek in the original New Testament. Son of Man is a rather complicated historical title, but its basic meaning means human being. It's a euphemism for guy. Does he see another Son of Man? Remember what he says is that the Son of Man must give his life. So he stands still and says, call him here. And they called him, saying to him, take heart. There's passion, right? Take heart. Get up, he's calling you. So here's the detail. So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Again, some of you have already heard this, but the cloak was a covering, a kind of tent for the blind beggar to live in. It was to keep him warm. He may have put his head down on it if he was taking a nap. But it was also his begging bowl. People would have thrown coins into the cloak. So to throw off his cloak isn't just a nice little detail about the story. It's really about this man changing. And notice the contrast with the rich man, who can't throw off his possessions. Now, you could be cynical and say, well, this man doesn't have much to lose. Well, maybe. He doesn't know he's going to be cured of blindness. And Jesus says to him, what do you want me to do for you? It's the question that Jesus asks every one of us. Sam said at the beginning of our study of the Gospel of Mark that the question Jesus asks that's so important in the Gospel of Mark is, who do people say that I am and who do you say that I am? And those are important questions. But so is this one. What is it you want me to do for you? I told the pilgrims last Sunday when we gathered, pick an intention for your journey. Know what it is you're searching for. Know what it is you're looking for. It's risky to do that, of course, because you could be disappointed. But this man has no question about what he wants, apparently. He said, my teacher, let me see again. Again. In other words, he hasn't been blind from birth. He remembers what it's like to see. At some point, he was a seeing person. Again, if you don't over-literalize this, we all have blinders. We all remember when we saw the road better than we see it at certain moments, and we knew where we were headed. We knew where we would catch a glimpse of God, and we lose track of that. It's a really good thing to say to Jesus, I want to see again. I want to see the road again. Jesus said to him, notice Jesus doesn't say, I heal you. In fact, if you read the Gospels, Jesus never once says the words, I heal you. He says, go, your faith has made you well. Something about this man's trust, that's how I translate faith, something about this man's trust has healed him. Trust that there's a road that can be seen, trust that he can see again, trust that Jesus is trustworthy. I don't know what he trusts. That he decides to trust in something other than his cloak. And it says, immediately he regained his sight. And notice the third part that we often forget with the rich man, and followed him on the way. So Rainey's already asked you the question if you were at 9 o'clock. But I'll ask you again. What do you want? What are you willing to throw off? What road do you want to travel? Do you want to go with Jesus or not? And lest you think that somehow Jesus is just about words instead of deeds, immediately after this story is Jesus' entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. This is a beautifully constructed gospel. They're all beautifully constructed. I happen to love Mark more than the other three. Without a beat, Bartimaeus has decided to follow Jesus, and Jesus decides to go into Jerusalem, which is where he's going to die. And he decides what kind of procession he's going to have. If you read my blog, I've already said this to you, but I'll just say it, drawing on a wonderful book called The Last Week by John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg. They postulate that there were two processions that entered Jerusalem on that Palm Sunday. One, a very triumphal militaristic procession led by Pontius Pilate, representative of Roman authority, wealth, power. Pontius Pilate would not have been on a donkey. He would have been on a war horse, and he would have been armed. And he would have been followed by people armed to the teeth. Jesus chooses a different entry. he asks to ride a donkey. Now there's a prediction in one of the prophets about the Messiah coming on a donkey. And Jesus seems to be fulfilling that. But it also speaks visually very powerfully. So now I'd like you to look at the front of your handout again. Upper left corner, a medieval painting. Notice it's oak leaves and garments being put in front of Jesus. The Middle Ages didn't import palms from the Holy Land for their Palm Sunday. They used whatever they had. And notice how low to the ground the donkey is. Jesus' feet are just, what, 1.5 feet off the ground? By the way, that's probably how high off the ground his feet were at the cross. We have all these visual images of him way up in the air. That is not the way the crosses were. Low to the ground. And then I've given you 2 portrayals of Palm Sunday from other cultures, because we can get so stuck on what Palm Sunday means to us here in North America in the 21st century. In the middle of the page on the right is a procession of women in India on Palm Sunday. If you look carefully, they also have in the middle of their forehead the red mark that means that they worship Krishna. These are women who are willing to see God in many places, including Jesus. And then there's a drawing of Jesus as if he were entering a village in Africa. We hear this story and read it and understand it in varying ways. And you need to keep doing that because the Spirit's going to speak to you in your own way. But let me tell you what I think about this story very briefly. This is simply the final procession of someone who has been a servant his whole ministry. No weapons, but palms, symbols of peace, and symbols of victory without weapons. He is what I've called here on the handout an upside-down Messiah. No son of David, no Pontius Pilate. He's son of man, he's a guy going the way of servanthood and inviting us on the way. Why might you want to go that way? Well, you'll have your own answers. My answer as a child of the United States, where I have unbelievable privilege, is that it hasn't worked, this road. The road of power over hasn't worked any better for us than it worked for Rome. You may want to crucify me on my way out of the bed. I'm just telling you how I see it. We still value power over more than power with. And it's a long and hard road to get from power over to power with. I can't tell you what your road should be. That's between you and Jesus. I will say that it's going to involve choices. And I believe that power with in the kingdom really would change the world. You can call me naive. I think it's naive to think that violence is going to make it work. It never has. So it's risky, these choices. And remember that Jesus looks at you and loves you. as you try to make the choices.
Amen.